Hi, this is a recording of Good News to the Poor, a Christian perspective on economics, and I hope you enjoy this first of two podcasts. Welcome to dchurch.com.
We've really got to break that consumerism cycle, which again is where the Christian narrative comes in very strong. The stacks of times that Jesus challenges people to, be content with what you've got rather than, going and want more and more, particularly when it often involves exploiting others.
As followers of Christ, we don't come across as being the Pharisees as well. I thank you, Lord, that I'm not like that populist who keeps voting for their own self-interest, but I, as more enlightened, are able to vote for the global good. I think we need to recognize that.
Welcome, everybody. Today we're doing another episode in our occasional series, Things I Never Heard in Church. And this time we're thinking about money, the wealth of nations, and a Christian view of economics. And we're trying to avoid the old binaries of left and right agendas, socialism, capitalism, of government interference versus hands-off approaches, and so on and so forth, and trying to discover whether there are alternative ways of thinking about this within the Judeo-Christian tradition. And with me to navigate these at times murky waters are two experts. Firstly, Amar Breckenridge. He has an undergraduate degree in economics and philosophy and a master's in economics for development, both of them from Oxford University. I'm a Cambridge man myself, but I'll forgive him for that. He has studied theology at Ridley College in Melbourne, and he is a professional economist, now working for a consulting firm based in Europe and Australia. And he's worked as a staff economist for the World Trade Organization Secretariat and for the government of Uganda as a fellow of the Overseas Development Institute in London. And his areas of work include international trade and economics, environmental economics and development, and he is based in Geneva. So welcome, Amar.
Thank you, Julian.
With him is it's good to have you with us. With him is Brett Inder, and he is a professor of I can't even say that, Brett.
Econometrics.
Econometrics, thank you, at Monash University in Melbourne. And his research interests are in the economics of those on the margins, including the economics of mental health and access to services, economic perspectives on support for young people in an out-of-home care settings, and the study of poverty and livelihoods among the poorest communities in developing countries. And his research in the past 10 years has mostly been focused on a range of economic issues facing Timor-Leste. So welcome, Brett, too. With these esteemed fellows is me, and I just about managed to balance my household finances from time to time. They say money talks, all it ever says to me is goodbye. So I'm feeling a little bit out of my depth here, but I'm glad to have these people to keep me in line as we talk about a worldview and how to cope with a Christian view of economics. Welcome to dchurch.com. Gentlemen, let's get into this. Let's firstly set the parameters of what we're talking about here. And I guess the first question I want to ask you, gents, is the very basic one about what is economics and why it's something that followers of Jesus need to think about. Brett, do you want to lead us off?
Sure, yep. Good question. I get that question often from my relatives when I tell them what I do. So what on earth is economics? And I've got a fairly simple answer, which is that economics is the study or the science of creating wealth and sharing or distributing wealth. So it's essentially about it focuses on material wealth primarily, and how do we increase the material wealth that we have available to ourselves within society, bearing in mind that there's only a limited amount of resources, but also how do we share that reasonably and respectfully amongst all the citizens of the world or in our particular society. So that sort of increasing of wealth, but also that distribution of wealth kinds of questions. As to why it should matter to a Christian perspective, well, I guess it matters to anyone who cares about the way societies work, because pretty much anything that we do on a day-to-day basis has a cost associated with it, or it has some material possessions associated with it. And we need to have the resources to be able to afford that car that we drive, or to be able to afford that bus that we take, to be able to afford the food that we eat, that most of us are able to take for granted. And the study or the understanding of how those resources become available to human beings is pretty important, and particularly when you think about the distributional side of things. And the reality is that when it comes to wealth, the issue actually is not so much how much wealth do we have in the world, but how is that wealth distributed. And there's lots of examples of that people are aware of the extremities of great wealth amongst the richest of the rich, and at the other extreme, the poorest of the poor. And that makes us realise that actually a pretty important question that we have to wrestle with is how on earth how come the rich get so rich, and how come the poor remain so poor? And that question then becomes a question of ethics and values, which is where the Christian story comes in. Because as a sort of a follower of the story in the Bible, first thing I learn is that people are made in the image of God. So that poor person living in the poorest of communities in some developing country is of equal value in the sight of God as that billionaire in North America or wherever. And somehow that doesn't seem to make sense with the way in which those people's lives have worked out and the material wealth that they have. So I think as Christians, we have to enter to that conversation and wrestle with that, and figure out how do we respond to it, and what contribution do we make. Because probably, whilst I'm an economist and I'm a great fan of economics, it mostly doesn't provide us with enough answers to the kind of questions the big questions that we have, and we're stuck in the world with some big problems. And, economics is very important to wrestle with in the context of addressing those problems, but actually it's still struggling to find answers. And we need a values perspective to overlay the way we think about the issues.
It's interesting you use the word story, because I guess story shapes the way we frame our economics, and what story we tell, and what that becomes part of the whole narrative of what frames world economics. Is this just something that's for those who are on a higher level of economic thinking, or is it for the ordinary person to be thinking about these things, and how does that work?
Good question. Unfortunately, academics like to couch a lot of what we study, or what we're experts in jargon that makes it quite inaccessible to people. And that's a real problem, because actually the solutions to the world's problems won't be found just amongst the elite, the experts. The experts need to marry up their understanding, which is often quite sophisticated, of the world, with the realities of everyday experience. And often we're not very good at that. And so we don't have good insight into the way people's lives are lived every day. And we come up with solutions that sound great to us in theory, but actually don't work in practice.
Yes.
And so we actually need the whole of society to engage with, the important economic questions that we face. And somehow we've got to find the bridge between that academic jargon, which is very often very insightful into the way the world works. So it's important to understand and listen to it, with the everyday experience, the lived experience of people, and come up with solutions together and the ways forward together.
Yeah. So how do ethics and theology interplay with one another? Did you want to jump in here, Amar?
Yeah, thanks, Julian. And I think Brett has already launched that discussion very well, because he couched his definition in economics in terms of creation and distribution of wealth. Those clearly raised ethical questions as to how this should be done, normative questions as to how we should live. How do we measure wealth, and what's a suitable metric for deciding who should get what? Just building on what Brett just said, about jargon, a lot of jargon in economics actually disguises the ethical underpinnings of what's being said. So, for example, when economists talk about efficiency, for example, and when they talk about an outcome being socially efficient, they're making an ethically loaded statement. They're saying that an outcome is socially desirable because resources have been allocated in a way that most matches the preferences of individuals in society. And there are plenty of hidden ethical assumptions there. First, that preferences are a suitable metric for allocation. And then the questions as to how we should measure preferences and whose preferences matter. So economics is not value-free, and it's loaded with ethical assumptions. And the father of modern economics, Adam Smith, was an ethical philosopher first and foremost. You shouldn't try reading his Wealth of Nations without first reading his theory of moral sentiments, which was written nearly 2 decades before. And having said that, the driving force behind modern economics is not so much Scottish sentimentalism. That's not a dig at you, Jools. That's actually a reference to a school of philosophy.
Thank you for clarifying.
But it's the driving force is welfarist utilitarianism, which traces its roots back to philosophers like John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. That I think they would have a lot of unkind things to say about the way economics is practiced today. So it's not a values-free discipline, and Christian ethics has a lot to say about all of this. So, for example, if you think of the fundamental creation mandate that's been given by God to humanity to mandate humanity to flourish, that involves a stewardship of resources. But Christians have a particular view, as Brett said, as to how these resources should be marshaled. There's a sense of treating everyone as being in God's image, and you can't escape the overall narrative in the Bible that emphasizes God's heart for the poor, God's heart for the marginalized. And it's no coincidence that a lot of the language of redemption uses economics as a metaphor. So, the year of Jubilees, for example, and that great release of debt in the indebtedness in the Old Testament is appropriated in the New Testament to explain our redemption from sin and God's redemptive purposes in the world. So there are lots of points of intersection. Even a basic Christian principle such as doing unto others what you would have them do unto you has economic implications. Okay. And similarly, when God views creation as being good, he views it good in and of itself, and it's not dependent on the fact that we value it or not. So even if people prefer converting wetlands into shopping mall car parks, that doesn't necessarily mean that those preferences should drive our decisions, and that converting wetlands into shopping mall car parks is optimal resource management from a Christian point of view. I mention that because that's usually cited by secular economists as a way, as highlighting the shortcomings of the way wealth is traditionally accounted for, to the exclusion of environmental and natural capital.
Yes.
So there are a lot of points of intersection, and I think we shouldn't shy away from that, and we shouldn't allow economists from getting away. We shouldn't allow economists to get away from being explicit about their ethical assumptions and pretending that they're not doing ethics in the name of doing an objective science.
Yes, indeed. What about those who have at times in the church raised the question, for example, from the year of Jubilee, that the gospel spiritualize those terms into sin and salvation rather than an ethical assumption about what goes on in our ordinary everyday economics?
Yeah, that's an interesting stretch, isn't it, really? So
yeah, I think so. But
all that stuff in the Old Testament, which was about how Israel was to function as a well-functioning society that reflected God's values, are kind of all just become spiritual things today. And a little bit through Jesus, I think that's a little bit of a stretch, particularly because Jesus got stuck into the rich and powerful in his time. So he seemed to care about wealth, and he turned on its head the sense of value in human beings. He talked about the woman who gave a small amount actually gave more than the people that gave out of their surplus, out of their wealth. So he had some pretty strong views about money and distribution, which were very consistent with the values in the Old Testament, and including the year of Jubilee. And so I don't think we can escape it quite that easily.
Yeah, I'd second that. And I think a lot of the thrust of the Gospels and the epistles is to combat this idea of this sort of Gnostic separation between the spiritual and the physical. The gospel, if it's true, needs to be manifest in the physical world as well. And it's telling to me that when the early believers were confronted with the question, or what are the practical implications of believing in the death and resurrection of Jesus, the immediate inferences they drew were equality and nonviolence. And you see that in the historical record of how the early church behaved. I'd also add that, basic Christian principles like doing unto others as you would have them do unto you has egalitarian impacts, because you basically want to put yourself in the shoes of someone else, and you recognize that you want to have a society that really can avoid some of the worst forms of outcomes, because if you reason like that, that it could have been you, right? So your ability to do unto others as they would do unto you, as you'd have them do unto them. So you'd have them do to you. So, it implies an ability to put yourself in someone else's place, and even on modest assumptions about how risk averse we are, and we can test those by looking at our behavior in insurance markets and so forth. We'd want to be in a society that avoids really bad outcomes, and that has a bias towards being egalitarian. And that's actually not a line of reasoning that's exclusive to Christian ethics. You find that in other forms of secular ethics like utilitarianism or Rawlsian distribution economics. So
I feel like I'm going to need a glossary at the end of this podcast for some of these terms that we're talking about here.
Jools, can I put this in concrete terms, going right back to the first point that Amar talked about with efficiency? And I'll give you an example, hypothetical example. Suppose the health system had to make a choice between who to treat, because there's a scarce amount of resources. And my brother and I both turn up to the hospital at the same time. And we're about the same age, roughly, so it doesn't make any difference from that point of view. But I'm a university professor who gets paid, quite a bit of money. He's a bus driver. He doesn't get paid very much. He's probably got a happier life than me, but that's another point. When it comes to thinking about that from an efficiency point of view, it actually, but only one of us can get treated, because it's just not enough resources to treat everybody. From an efficiency point of view, it makes sense to treat me, and because my earning power is greater, so I'll contribute more to the society, at least to myself, by being the one that's healed rather than him. So you would make that decision on the basis of a person's productivity, if you like, and that might be okay for me, but I'm not sure if you follow that through logically to the way in which a world works. In fact, that's exactly what does happen, is that resources are allocated often to the ones who got the greater. So we talk in terms a lot of sort of political power, but it's actually often more economic power that they have that allows them access to things that the poor don't have access to. And when you sort of hold it in contrast of two people standing in a queue waiting for a hospital bed, and you say, we'll give it to him and not him because he's richer, that's quite a stark contrast. But actually that very same logic is applied to so many decisions we make. And it's hiding under a simple economic concept of efficiency. And so it has to be kind of brought out into the open and then debated as a society as to whether that's the way we want our society to be.
Very interesting. We could go down a rabbit warren of issues to talk about in that sort of category. But just let's bring our conversation into thinking about Australia as an example of a country and its recent journey over the last few years. What's happened here economically that might highlight some things we should note that would apply more widely, but in particular in terms of Australia?
Amar, why don't you start? Tell us your thoughts.
Sure. Okay. Well, I have to say, as a student of economics in Europe, Australia, particularly in the 90s, the 80s and 90s, was often held up as an example, and especially under the Hawke-Keating years, of how to do economic reform without the sort of dire social costs that you saw in the UK, for example, under Thatcherism. And I have to say, my first knowledge of Bob Hawke was not related to his politics, but rather the fact that he held a record for downing the speed in downing a pint of beer at the college I was studying at, where he was a Rhodes Scholar before my time. But having said that, so much of the economic reform program in Australia over the 80s and 90s was really, grounded in fairly standard neoclassical economics, and this applied to particularly things like trade policy, but also the deregulation of production markets and so forth. What's also striking is that this was complemented by quite a heavy investment in social programs like Medicare, which were driven by distributional concerns about fairness, but they also had an efficiency angle, as Brett would say, because things like public investment in health, it is not only a question of fairness, but it makes everyone better off. I stand to benefit from the fact that my coworker is healthy. It increases productivity. I guess what was interesting was that these sort of very market-minded reforms were led from what seemed to be a left-of-centre government, but which drew very heavily on the work of neoclassical economists of international stature, such as people like Ross Garnaut, Richard Snape, and Max Corden, sort of internationally recognized economists at the time. So that was an interesting part of the Australian story. But I guess what's also interesting is that when exactly the same body of economic theory was applied to another pressing set of issues, namely climate change and the environment, everything in Australia seems to have come unstuck, and Australia's moved from being, a star model reformer to being an international laggard by some mysterious alchemy. And it's not really easy to trace how that's happened. But the very principles that were once criticized by the hard left as being ones of economic rationalism are now being attacked by the hard right as an embodiment of global leftism. The underlying economic principles haven't changed. The principles that drive you to tax carbon emissions are exactly the same ones that will push you to reduce tariffs and get rid of quotas in international trade. As I said, it's hard to understand how this happened. It's perhaps partly the imported influence of hard right conservatism from places like the US, which has developed this sort of reflexive tendency to think that attacks of any form is a bad, and that state intervention of any form, and particularly those enshrined in global treaties, is something from the pits of hell. So that might be one reason, and unfortunately, what I call moral majority Christianity, which tends to embody what the American historian Richard Hofstadter called the paranoid strand in American politics, has played a very influential role in that. And I think that's been very damaging, to use economic language. It's been very damaging to the Christian brand overall.
Mm. Mm. So you go ahead, Brett.
I was just going to mention there's a couple of other examples sort of in our relatively recent history in Australia of sort of some interesting understandings of economics. And I go back to the global financial crisis, and probably the other place where we were held up as being a very impressive response to it under Kevin Rudd's government, where they invested a fair bit of money in economic stimulus to protect us from the worst of the downfall during the global crisis. And that's an interesting example of where sort of, in other crises that have taken place at that time and subsequently, there's this question of austerity that you might hear about, where countries are being advised to not focus on the stimulus approach, but rather to contract and reduce their spending. And I guess, let's not be partisan here. Thanks to Peter Costello and John Howard having a massive wealth fund, Kevin Rudd was in the position of being able to spend in the 2008 period after the crisis, because there was plenty of money in the bank, and that allowed us to ride through that. And we've kind of ended up in a similar situation in 2020 with another crisis that hits us. And we've got a government, this time a Conservative government, that has spent in 2020 like nobody ever has seen before, in responding to a crisis. So that's quite interesting because it kind of runs, in terms of the theories of economics, a little bit in contradiction to the previous sort of neoliberal approaches that sort of were emphasising small government. And anytime the government intervenes in the market or spends too much, then they drive up interest rates and they distort the market and they crowd out private investment and that sort of thing. Those kind of stories have sort of moved aside when we've had crises in 2008 and 2020, and pretty much we've recognised now that we actually quite appreciate the government stepping into the gap when a gap appears and helping us to ride through the rough patches. And I think both cases our governments have done very well with that.
You've been listening to Good News to the Poor, a Christian perspective on economics. This is the first of 2 podcasts. Hope you can join us next time for the second of these podcasts. Thanks for listening.